This week's Technique Tuesday is a much needed replacement for a video I uploaded back in 2009. In this video, I'll demonstrate the longtail cast-on. The longtail cast-on is one of many different ways to cast on stitches for the start of a knitting project. It's used for projects that start at an edge, like mittens or a hat, rather than something that would start at a closed position here where there isn't an edge. This cast-on requires one needle and 2 strands of yarn. Like most knitting techniques, there's more than one way to do this cast-on, and it has more than one name. The version I'll show you today is sometimes called the slingshot method, or it might be called the Continental method of a one needle cast-on. As I mentioned, there are 2 strands used to form this cast-on. One strand is the long tail, and it forms the twisted loops at the edge of the fabric, where the other strand is what's called the working yarn. It is the strand that is connected to the actual ball of yarn. If we look at this up close, we can see that underneath the needle are these twisted loops right here, and that's what's formed by this yarn right here. While this working yarn is what's forming the actual foundation row of stitches on the needle. So what I'm going to do is show you how to practice the cast on by just starting with 15 stitches. I have a US size 7 needle. That's a 4.5 millimeter needle if you use metric system. And the yarn I'm using is a worsted weight yarn. So that's sort of a mid-range of wool. The first thing we're going to do is measure off about 12 inches, which is about 30 centimeters of yarn. We're going to measure that from the end of the yarn, and this is going to be our starting point. So this end of the yarn is going to be the long tail that forms the loops under the needle, and this yarn that's connected to the ball is going to be the yarn that forms the loops on the needle. So measure off about 12 inches or 30 centimeters. Bring your left hand, your forefinger and your thumb together like this, and hang that yarn over them so that the tail is hanging over the front and the working yarn that's connected to the ball is hanging over the back. So it's just draped over there, and then you're going to take your fingers and you're going to clasp those strands against your palm. You're not going to hold them in a death grip. You just want to keep them in place so that you can apply extra pressure on them if you need to, but you can also easily loosen them up. So you're going to start off with this strand. You're going to pull your forefinger and your thumb apart a little bit. We're going to cast on the first step by creating a twisted loop. This is not going to be like the rest of the cast-on stitches. This is just the first one that gets us started and separates these 2 ends into 2 separate strands. So you're going to take your needle, going to put it down into this hole, and you're just going to twist the needle around so that you have a twisted loop on the needle. And that's your first cast-on stitch. If you prefer, you can use a slip knot to establish that first stitch, but it's not necessary. Now you're going to put your forefinger on that stitch, and you're going to release your grip a little bit so that you can pull the yarn away from here. And this is why it's called the slingshot method oftentimes. So now you've got 1 strand of yarn over your thumb and 1 strand over your index finger. So the rest of the cast-on stitches are all going to be as follows. You're going to take your needle, you're going to come through the front of this thumb loop, and you're going to use your needle to come around to the right and underneath that strand, and then your needle is going to pull that loop through your thumb loop like this. So now you have a stitch on the needle. You can take your thumb out here. Don't let go of the strands in your hand. Instead, take your thumb, swing it over the top of this to kind of tighten up that loop. You want there to be enough space between the two stitches so that the space between there needs to be about as thick as the two strands of yarn. You don't want to tighten things up like this because you'll never be able to knit those stitches on the next row. So I'm going to pull this out and I'm going to start again. Here's my first stitch going down toward me and just twisting like this. Pull it out a little bit to form my slingshot. I'm going to come through that thumb loop. You can see that other yarn through there, and you're just using your needle to grab that yarn so that you can pull it through the thumb loop. Let your thumb out of that loop, that twisted loop that's forming. Swing your thumb to tighten it up. And you're just tightening it up enough so that it kind of meets the bottom of the needle. You should be able to easily slide these stitches along the needle. So that is what you're going to repeat over and over again. You're going to go through the front of that loop on your thumb. You're going to come around to the right of that strand that's over your index finger and grab it. And now you're pulling it through that thumb loop. And once it's through and you've got something on the needle, you can put your finger on there if you need to. Let your thumb out and just swing your thumb over that to tighten it up. So see how they're spaced across? What I would discourage you from doing is pulling down on the stitches after you create each one. So don't like pull down on that to tighten them up. First of all, it's going to not give you the correct tension easily, and it's going to be very tedious to do that. The other thing I want to show you is if your hands do let go of the strands somehow and you need to get them back together, hold your needle up like this, get your finger and thumb together and put them in between those two strands like that, and then grasp those strands, and then you can get back to your slingshot. One of the challenges with this cast on is in estimating the length of tail that you are going to need for the number of stitches that you need to cast on. The more stitches you're going to need, the longer the tail is going to be. The thicker your yarn is, the larger those stitches will be, and therefore the more yarn you'll need. So there are a couple of really good ways of estimating the amount of tail that you're going to use, and that includes if you were using the method that I showed you here, where you measure off a tail and then start at a point where the stitches are going to be cast on using up the yarn for both strands in the same direction. If you are casting on a ton of stitches, then you might want to, instead of measuring off a long tail, actually use two separate strands of yarn. They could be from two separate balls of yarn. In fact, one of these could be a completely different color, which would make the edge this contrasting color. Or you could use two ends of the same ball of yarn. Either one can work so that you do have two short tails at this starting end, and then you grip those, and then you can just cast on as many stitches as you need to. And then when you're finished, you cut the thumb yarn leaving about a 4 to 6 inch tail. That's one method. Another method is that if you're using a yarn like a non-superwash wool, you can actually take the two tails of the same ball of yarn, and you can do what's called spit felting them, or creating a felted join that joins the two ends together, and then you can just cast on until you've cast on all your stitches, and again cut a tail. I have an entire video about long tail cast on yarn estimation and those different tricks that I just briefly talked about, which I will leave up above, but I'll also leave down in the video description. The long tail cast on is a versatile cast on method that can be adjusted in a variety of ways. It's also one of the few cast on methods for which there is a matching bind off. If you'd like to learn more about different ways of using the long tail cast on, check out this playlist of videos over here. And if you'd like to learn the matching bind off to the long tail cast on, check out this video down here. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those down below. And to my daughter Nina, who recently learned the long tail cast on from that old video I uploaded in 2009, I hope this one doesn't look like it was filmed using a microwave. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.